Graham Wexler asked me to end our marriage, while the anniversary cake still sat untouched between his mother's pearls and Cassidy Vale's white wine. The private dining room in Raleigh glowed with candlelight, the kind that made expensive people look forgiving before they became witnesses. Celia Wexler rested one hand on her necklace, already wearing the pleased little smile she saved for moments that protected her son. Cassidy sat 2 chairs from him under the harmless title of outside consultant, though her knee kept turning toward his like a secret seeking permission. I had just lifted my fork when Graham tapped his glass once and placed a cream envelope beside my plate. For one breath, everyone expected a toast. Because men like Graham trained rooms to expect grace, even when they arrived carrying damage. He looked at me with that polished public face and murmured, "I want us to handle this cleanly, Meredith, before it turns ugly." The envelope opened under his fingers, and the first page showed voluntary separation and operational release in black print. My stomach tightened, but my face stayed still, because the room had been arranged to measure whether I would break. Graham slid the papers closer and added, "The firm, the clients, the name, stay with me. You can take what is personal." Cassidy lowered her eyes to straighten her napkin. Not surprised enough to be innocent, not confident enough to hide that she had rehearsed this. Celia exhaled, like the hard part was already over, and 2 guests suddenly became fascinated by their dessert spoons. I signed the first page, then the second, hearing the small scratch of the pen louder than Graham's practiced breathing beside me. Every signature felt less like surrender and more like a receipt he was too arrogant to read before handing it across the table. When I reached the last page, Graham leaned close enough for his cologne to cover the sugar in the room and whispered, "You're making this easier for both of us." I capped the pen and looked at him until his smile lost its edge, then kept my voice low enough for the whole table to lean in. "No, Graham, you just chose the wrong place to do this." The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt freshly noticed, as if every glass and folded napkin had become evidence. I walked back through that dining room with the signed pages in my purse, and every face suddenly pretending dessert needed attention. These were the same people who had sent me midnight emails when clients threatened to walk. Contracts stalled, or Graham forgot details before important calls. Now they studied cake crumbs and wine stems, because silence felt cheaper than choosing the woman who had kept their emergencies invisible. Celia touched Graham's sleeve like a mother calming a gifted son after a difficult presentation, not a man who had just staged his wife's removal. For years, Graham had been the voice in the room, and I had been the hands under the table keeping the room from collapsing. Client recovery notes carried my initials, campaign drafts carried my edits, and old metadata still showed M. Pruitt beneath strategies Graham later described as instinct. He called me supportive because supportive sounded grateful, temporary, and too polite to ask why her name disappeared from the final deck. I remembered Rebecca Sutter making me sign a separate agreement years earlier, after one nervous client demanded proof that someone competent could protect the account if Graham failed. Near the coat room, Graham softened his voice for the remaining guests and murmured, "Meredith needs space, and I'll make sure this transition stays respectful." Cassidy stepped beside him before anyone asked her anything, smoothing the edge of her blazer as if she already belonged to the answer. "I can help keep clients calm," she offered, and the sentence landed too smoothly to be spontaneous. I placed the envelope deeper inside my purse and watched both of them smile like people who had mistaken a locked door for an exit. Outside, the Raleigh night felt colder than it should have, but my hand stayed steady while I reached my car. I did not call my mother, did not cry into the steering wheel, and did not give Graham the messy scene he had clearly budgeted for. My phone lit before I started the engine, showing an alert from an old company account Graham believed had gone dark months earlier. The subject line read, "Client Authority Review," and for the first time all night, the silence around me felt useful. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat, its cream paper catching every red light, like something still pretending to be civilized. My dress still smelled of candle smoke and restaurant sugar when I opened my laptop on the kitchen table without turning on the living room lamps. Graham had always believed dead accounts stayed dead, because he believed access belonged to whoever announced ownership the loudest. The old company login accepted my password on the second try, and the inbox opened like a door someone forgot to lock. The newest message came from a client compliance office, asking who held authority if the firm's principal created reputational risk during active representation. I read the subject twice before opening the attachment, because my name appeared in the preview beside language Graham would have dismissed as paperwork. The agreement was years old. Drafted after one major client demanded proof that someone besides Graham could protect the account if his judgment compromised them. Rebecca Sutter had made me sign it separately, while Graham signed beside his initials without reading past the first page. The clause sat halfway down, clean and almost boring, which made it more dangerous than anything spoken at that table. If the principal representative created public conduct that threatened client confidence, temporary authority shifted to the named director of client recovery until review. The named director was Meredith Pruitt. Not Graham Wexler, not Cassidy Vale, and not anyone carrying his last name like a master key. I stared at that sentence until the humiliation from dinner changed shape inside me. Not softer, just useful. I called Rebecca before sunrise, still wearing the same earrings Celia had complimented before watching her son hand me those papers. Rebecca answered on the third ring, quiet but awake, and I heard a pen click before she asked how public Graham had made it. I sent the short video one guest had posted and deleted, where Graham's envelope slid across the table while Cassidy sat ready beside him. Rebecca watched enough to understand, then said, "This is no longer only marital. Meredith. This touches client authority." Graham texted while the file sat open, asking me not to embarrass both of us by reacting publicly. He did not ask whether I got home safely, whether I understood the papers, or whether dinner had broken anything beyond his image. By dawn, Rebecca had requested an advisory meeting, and I finally understood what he had handed me. By mid-morning, I sat across from Graham in the glass conference room where I had once fixed client disasters before he arrived with coffee. He came in wearing the same Navy confidence he used at dinner, smoothing his tie while pretending the advisory panel had gathered to comfort him. Cassidy entered behind him with a laptop tucked against her ribs, although no one had invited an outside consultant into a client authority review. She chose the chair nearest Graham, and that one small decision made the whole room understand she had never believed she was outside anything. Rebecca did not raise her voice, which made Graham's smile work harder than it should have. She placed the agreement on the table, then asked Cassidy which contract allowed her to access active client transition materials. Cassidy blinked once and looked toward Graham before offering, "I was helping maintain continuity during a sensitive personal matter." Rebecca slid over the calendar invite with Cassidy's own notes attached, including a draft phrase about Meredith becoming emotional if confronted. Graham leaned forward too quickly, calling the language informal, private, and taken out of context before anyone accused him of anything specific. I looked at the recovery log on the screen. Where my initials sat beside every saved account, Graham claimed he had personally protected. "You called it continuity," I told him quietly, because theft sounds less professional when clients are listening. The panel chair stopped writing, and for the first time, Graham's face showed the cost of being understood too clearly. Then Nolan Greer's message arrived on Rebecca's phone, and the room shifted before she even opened it. His screenshots showed Cassidy's temporary badge access after hours, followed by Graham's request to restrict my login once the dinner was over. Cassidy stared at the table as if polished wood could swallow evidence, while Graham reached for his phone and found no sentence ready. Rebecca placed the screenshots beside the agreement, and suddenly the consultant beside my husband looked less like support and more like a signature he forgot to hide from the beginning. The room did not explode after Nolan's screenshots landed beside the agreement, which somehow made Graham look even smaller. The advisory panel did what careful people do when power becomes liability. They lowered their voices and started protecting the clients. Graham kept waiting for someone to call it a misunderstanding, but no one reached for that word after seeing Cassidy's badge access and his request to restrict mine. When the panel chair limited his authority during the review, Graham laughed once, then checked his phone like the system might disagree with the people inside it. His client portal had already changed by the time Rebecca refreshed the screen, leaving his name visible but his control reduced. That was when the money surfaced. Not as the first lie. Only the easiest lie to document. Rebecca opened vendor records tied to marketing expenses. The kind Graham had always waved past me as routine brand maintenance. Some invoices led to vague outside strategy work. But the deliverables looked less like client service and more like Graham polishing a future with Cassidy. I remembered every month he told me budgets were tight, while I sat with angry clients and promised their campaigns would not suffer. I remembered cutting my own hours on paper so his reports looked leaner, then staying late anyway because accounts did not care who got credit. Now those same cold invoices showed where the missing E's had gone. Not into growth, not into stability, but into the image he needed before replacing me. Graham pushed back from the table and muttered, "This is being twisted." But the panel chair kept reading instead of answering him. Outside the conference room, Celia tried to repair the damage with the only tool she trusted, a private call to someone important. Her voice floated through the glass when she told a longtime client that Meredith was making Graham's personal pain look professional. Rebecca stepped into the hallway just as the client responded through the speaker. Calm and unmistakable, that they had seen the dinner video and wanted account stability through Meredith. Celia's hand dropped from her pearls, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked less offended than afraid. The money had not broken the room open. It had only proved the room had been cracking around me for years. Nolan's email reached Rebecca before noon, and the chain looked ordinary until the subject line opened its mouth. Cassidy had drafted what she called a transition story, where I would step back for rest while Graham reassured clients and she protected the firm's tone. Every sentence sounded polished enough to pass through a conference room without raising suspicion, which made it worse than an insult. She had not wanted my chair. Not publicly. She wanted my usefulness wrapped in softer words until nobody noticed the theft. The phrase that held me still was exhaustion concern, placed beside my name like a diagnosis. Nobody had earned the right to write. I did not cry when I read it, because tears would have made their language feel prophetic, and I refused to decorate their lie. Cassidy had used the words women hear before doors close: rest, transition, stability, support, all arranged like polite furniture around a professional erasure. Graham had brought the envelope, but Cassidy had clearly helped build the room where he expected me to disappear quietly. I saw her later in the law office waiting area, standing near the window with her phone pressed against her palm. She looked composed until I walked closer. Then her shoulders tightened before her face remembered arrogance. "Graham told me your marriage had been over for a long time," she offered, as if that explained client files, calendar notes, and my name placed inside her exit plan. I kept my voice even and asked why an outside consultant was drafting responses about my capacity before my husband had even told me we were separating. Cassidy opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was no harmless version of that answer. Her phone buzzed twice in her hand, but she did not look down, and I knew without seeing the screen that Graham was calling the only ally still standing close enough to blame. By evening, 2 clients had paused her freelance contracts, and 1 agency withdrew from a pending review after seeing her notes in the access file. The woman beside him had planned too carefully to look innocent, and not carefully enough to remain useful. The courtroom gave Graham no clean stage, and that seemed to confuse him more than the evidence waiting on the table. My attorney asked the judge to review the separation agreement, because Graham had folded operational release language into marital papers, then presented everything publicly. He sat beside his lawyer wearing rehearsed regret, but the exhibits made regret look late and smaller than the room. I kept my hands still because the judge did not need tears when documents could speak without trembling. The first question made Graham look careless before he found the injured voice he had prepared for the room. Why would client authority language appear inside a personal separation packet presented before I had independent counsel at that table? His lawyer called it administrative cleanup. But Rebecca's earlier agreement showed my authority existed long before Graham decided I should disappear. Then the dinner video played briefly. Not for spectacle. Only to show the room, the envelope, and Cassidy sitting ready beside him. Graham leaned toward the microphone and claimed he only wanted a respectful ending before everything became painful for both of us. I looked at the calendar notes, badge records, and login message near his elbow, then answered that clean was not bringing an audience. A consultant, and work papers to make your wife sign herself smaller. The judge did not react loudly, but his pen stopped moving long enough for Graham to notice the room had shifted. By the end of that hearing, the agreement was no longer treated like the final word he expected it to be. His client authority stayed limited during review, and the court allowed further examination of how those papers were prepared and presented. Celia's documented client call followed her outside the courthouse, and within days, one community board asked her to step back from leadership. Nolan lost his account lead position because silence had helped the wrong people, though cooperation kept him from disappearing into Graham's version. I walked out without the lightness people imagine after public vindication, because being believed still leaves bruises beneath the skin. Graham stood near the steps under the courthouse's hard morning light, watching former clients pass without stopping, and my name left that courthouse attached to evidence. Not emotion, sounding like mine again. Months later, the firm no longer carried Graham's name like a shield nobody was allowed to question. The advisory panel restructured the client recovery practice, and the accounts that stayed did so under terms requiring my authority in writing. I did not keep the old office, the old title, or the old habit of making myself smaller so difficult men could feel natural. When the first new contract arrived, the signature line read Meredith Pruitt, Principal Advisor, and I stared at it longer than I expected. Graham's circle did not vanish overnight, because people like him always find someone willing to call damage complicated. But clients stopped inviting him into rooms where trust mattered, and the ones who still answered his calls did so carefully. Cassidy left Raleigh's consulting network quietly after her notes followed her into every reference conversation she could not control. Celia still appeared at luncheons with perfect hair and colder smiles, but no one handed her guest lists, donor names, or anything fragile enough to need discretion. I saw Graham once more outside a small leadership event where I had been asked to speak about reputation after public failure. He looked thinner, not broken enough to be pitied, just stripped of the shine other people had helped him maintain. He watched me approach the entrance and murmured, "Did you really want it to end like this?" Meredith, I looked at the badge in my hand, then at the man who once mistook my peace for permission. "No, Graham," I answered softly. "I wanted a quiet life, and you confused quiet with erasable." Inside, my name sat on the door beside a clean brass plate that did not borrow anyone else's history. For a second, I remembered the anniversary table, the envelope, Cassidy's folded napkin, and Celia's relieved breath when they thought I had signed myself away. Then the memory passed, not because it stopped hurting, but because it no longer owned the room I entered. Healing did not feel like forgetting. It felt like hearing my own name spoken clearly and knowing nobody in that room had the power to make it smaller. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Sometimes peace begins when a woman stops begging to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding her. If this felt close to real life, share your thoughts below, and let this space hold every quiet woman who finally chose herself.